Hello and welcome to another tutorial in the CSS series. In the previous tutorial, we spoke about pseudo classes and we went over a few examples of how to use pseudo classes. In this tutorial, let's talk about pseudo elements. Before we dive into what a pseudo element is, I'm going to clean up some of the CSS that we have in this file. Let's keep this very minimal. And I'm going to add an ID to our first div and retain this CSS which is from our previous tutorial. So it's going to be pseudo class example. Okay, and let me also confine the style to only the first div, which has an ID of div1. First, let's make sure if the style is still working. So it did work. Now let me go to the file and then add another section for pseudo element example. All right, now let's define what a pseudo element is. A pseudo element is a CSS keyword which lets you target specific parts of a HTML element, and then you can style those HTML element specifically. So for that, let's try to come up with some scenarios. The first scenario is uh, I'll take I'll create another div first and call this is a div2 element. Now let's talk about the scenario. The scenario is I want to target the first letter of this div element and then style it differently from the rest of the characters in that div element. So what I will be doing is I'm going to target the element using hash div2 as my selector, and the way I target the first letter is by giving a pseudo element. The pseudo element name is called as first letter in this case, and the convention that I use for adding a pseudo element is two colons, which is different from using a single colon. When we use a single colon, it becomes a pseudo class. But when we use a two colon, that becomes a pseudo element. So this is the difference between the convention and this is the pseudo element name. First, I take this back. It's first letter, not the first line. So I can now add some colors to this. So I add a color to this letter, the first letter, which is T in this case. And let's also give it a font size, which is different from the rest of the characters. So I have a font size of 30 pixels and a color of, I think this looks like pink or orangish color. So let me save this, go back, and then as we can see, it has this color. And the alphabet also looks bigger than the rest of the elements. So that's how we were able to target a specific part of the element, in this case, the first letter, using a pseudo element. Now let's also talk about another example. I'm going to create a paragraph, in this case, paragraph, and hit save. Now the other example that I want to show is using paragraph as a selector, and then I'll add my pseudo element convention of two colons. This time I'd like to style the first line and give this a color of green, Um, okay, so I think this is fine. So I'll just give it a color of green. Go back and refresh. As you can see, the paragraph, complete paragraph, has the green color. But what is so special about this? Now, let me go back and add multiple. Let me make this into a big sentence by copy pasting the same content, and then I go back and refresh this. Now we can clearly see the difference. The first sentence here has the green color, and the rest of from the second sentence, it has a regular paragraph styling. So what that tells us is the first line pseudo element. By using the first line pseudo element, we were able to target the first line and style it differently from the rest of the paragraph. So again, by using the pseudo element, we were able to target a specific part of the HTML element. Okay, now let's talk about two of the most commonly used pseudo elements. This is um, uh, this is most commonly used in pseudo element example like in CSS, which is before and after. So the first one is before. So let's create one example here. So I'll make use of div2 and call this with before pseudo element. What I'd like to do is before this content in div2. So basically div2 colon colon before is going to add a content of, let's say, div. So I'm going to add this text before div2. That's what this means. Let's see if this is going to work. I'll save this file and then reload. As you can see, it has added div before the div2 element. Now let's take a look at why it has added the color. Okay, so since div is the first letter within the div content, it has increased the font size. It has basically applied this uh, styling to it. Instead, let's make this div after and then hit refresh. As we can see, now the content has been placed after the div element content. So that's how we can selectively append or prepend content before or after the HTML elements. One one side note here, when we are using the first line um, pseudo element only works on a block level element, which means it only works on a heading tag or a div tag or a paragraph tag. These are all block level elements. It doesn't work on a span element. We can just do a quick check on that to confirm. So I add span and then add a color of indigo. Let me go back and then add some span content to it. I'll hit save and then go back. As you can see, the color did not change for span because the first line the first line only works for the first line pseudo element only works for block level elements and not inline elements. So that's another side note to remember. So since we have covered before and after, let's also talk about two more pseudo elements. The the other pseudo element that I want to talk is called as the selection pseudo element. So I'm going to use the same selector, the paragraph selector, and add the selection uh, pseudo element to it, and then give it a color, or maybe a background color of light coral. I'll hit save, go back and refresh. Now take a look at what happens when I click and drag on top of this paragraph element. It's highlighting it in that coral, uh, light coral color, background color. So it has changed the default selection color. If we want to have customized selection highlights, we can make use of the selection pseudo element to do that. All right. Now let's create another type of pseudo element which is used for list elements. For that, let me create a list item. So in this list item, I'll add a bunch of list elements. So I've added 3 different eatables as list items. Let me save this, go back and hit refresh. As we can see our list elements. Now, what if I want to change the color of these markers? For that, we have a pseudo element to target this marker styling specifically, and then add some CSS to it. So what I'll do is I'll use the pseudo element convention of 2 colons and then add marker and add some color to it, light green. Save this, hit refresh. As you can see, the marker color has changed to light green. This is how I was able to target a particular section of this element and style it. So, so pseudo elements again are used to target specific uh, specific uh, parts of a HTML element, and then we can target and style them using this convention. So that is all I wanted to cover as part of this tutorial. Let's talk about a few more topics in the CSS in the coming tutorials. So if you have any questions, um, or if you are approaching CSS for the first time, if you want any topics to be covered, please let me know in the comment section. I'll try to make a video on those topics, and please do like and subscribe to this channel, and I'll keep you posted on the further tutorials and videos. See you in the next one.